It was supposed to be a final goodbye. A moment of closure. Ethan stood before the small white coffin, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch his baby girl's delicate fingers one last time. Ava was gone. That was what the doctors at St. Joseph Medical Center had told him and Lauren, his wife. She was just 10 months old, a life barely begun, yet already taken. The air inside the funeral home in Dallas, Texas, was thick with grief. Muffled sobs echoed softly, blending with the faint rustling of tissue against tear-streaked faces. Lauren sat motionless, her eyes red and swollen, staring blankly at the tiny, still form of their daughter. How had it come to this? Just days ago, Ava had been giggling in her arms, her chubby little fingers reaching for strands of her mother's hair. Now, she lay there, cold and lifeless, wrapped in the cruel silence of death. Family and friends whispered their condolences, their voices hushed as if afraid to disturb the solemnity of the moment. Aunt Margaret, Ethan's older sister, placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, but he barely felt it. His mind was drowning in memories, the way Ava's laughter had once filled their home, the way she would kick her little legs excitedly whenever she saw him walk through the door. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay composed. Then, it happened. As he ran his thumb over Ava's tiny hand, he felt it move, a faint twitch, so subtle he almost dismissed it as a cruel trick of his grief-clouded mind. He sucked in a sharp breath, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. No, it couldn't be. Ethan froze, his fingers tightening around Ava's hand. There it was again, a tiny, almost imperceptible squeeze. His body went rigid, his breath caught in his throat. Had he imagined it? Lauren, he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible over the low murmurs in the room. Lauren, I think. He stopped himself, afraid of saying the words out loud, afraid of hope. But Lauren had already noticed the shift in his expression. Slowly, as if moving through water, she stood up and walked toward the coffin. She reached out trembling hand and placed it on Ava's forehead. And then she gasped. She's warm, she choked out, her voice a mix of disbelief and fear. Aunt Margaret, who had been standing nearby, took a step forward, her brows furrowing. What did you say? She's warm. Lauren turned to Ethan, her face pale. She shouldn't be, right? She's supposed to be. She couldn't finish the sentence. A hush fell over the room. Whispers grew into murmurs, then into startled exclamations. Relatives exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to believe what they were hearing. Ethan, his hands shaking, leaned down once more. He wrapped his fingers around Ava's tiny hand, his pulse pounding so loudly it was deafening. And then, in the middle of what was supposed to be her funeral, their baby girl moved again. This time, there was no denying it. The shocking discovery. The funeral home, once filled with quiet mourning, had become a scene of hushed panic. Eyes widened, hands trembled, and whispers rippled through the room like an electric current. Ethan's breath came in short, sharp bursts as he stared at Ava's tiny fingers, now curled ever so slightly around his own. His mind screamed that it wasn't possible, that his baby girl had been declared dead. But the warmth in her skin and the unmistakable movement of her hand defied everything he had accepted just moments ago. Lauren clutched Ethan's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve as she struggled to process what she was seeing. Ethan, what's happening? Her voice quivered, teetering between hope and terror. Aunt Margaret, who had been standing nearby, quickly stepped closer. She hesitated for a moment before reaching out and pressing her palm against Ava's cheek. Her eyes darted back to Ethan. She's warm, Ethan, she's warm. The tension in the room grew unbearable. Guests who had come to pay their respects now stood frozen, their sorrow replaced by confusion and fear. Some murmured prayers under their breath, while others exchanged doubtful glances. Could it really be happening? Could Ava still be alive? Ethan's head spun, but instinct overpowered doubt. He bent down, pressing his ear gently against his daughter's chest, desperate to hear something, anything. At first, there was only silence, but then, a faint, rhythmic sound. It was so soft, so distant, as if buried beneath layers of uncertainty. His hands flew to Ava's tiny ribcage, feeling for the impossible, and there it was, a slight, uneven rise and fall. His daughter was breathing, she was alive. We need help, Ethan suddenly shouted, his voice breaking through the stunned silence. He turned wildly toward the gathering of friends and family. Someone, please. Get a doctor. Call 911. She's breathing. The room erupted into chaos. Lauren fell to her knees beside the coffin, tears streaming down her face as she whispered her daughter's name over and over. Ava, baby, it's mommy. Stay with us, sweetheart, please. Margaret was already pulling out her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed frantically. We need an ambulance, now. Amidst the commotion, Ethan turned to his childhood friend, Daniel, who had come to the funeral to support them. There's a pharmacy across the street, drive. Carter is there, tell him to come, hurry. Daniel didn't hesitate. He sprinted out of the funeral home, his dress shoes slamming against the pavement as he raced across the road. Inside the pharmacy, Dr. Carter, a man in his 50s with sharp, attentive eyes, was restocking shelves when Daniel burst through the door, gasping for air. Dr. Carter, you have to come, now. The pharmacist frowned, startled by the urgency in Daniel's voice. What's going on? Daniel could barely get the words out. It's Ava. She's alive. Dr. Carter's face went pale. What? They declared her dead. But she just moved. She's warm, she's breathing. You have to come. The disbelief in Dr. Carter's expression lasted only a second before instinct kicked in. He grabbed his stethoscope and a portable monitor, shoving them into a bag before following Daniel out the door. Back at the funeral home, panic had reached its peak. People were on their phones, voices overlapping in frantic conversation. How could this happen? Some family members were too shocked to react, while others clung to the hope that Ava had somehow, miraculously, survived. Dr. Carter rushed into the room, pushing past stunned mourners to reach the small white coffin. Ethan and Lauren immediately stepped back to give him space, their eyes pleading for an answer. Everyone, quiet. I need silence, Dr. Carter commanded, his voice firm but unsteady. The murmurs died down, replaced by an eerie tension. He placed his stethoscope against Ava's chest. The room held its breath. Seconds passed. Then, his brows furrowed. He adjusted the stethoscope, pressing deeper. A moment later, his eyes widened. Ethan watched as the color drained from Dr. Carter's face. Tell me you hear something, he begged, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Carter swallowed hard. I think I do, he muttered. His fingers moved swiftly, placing the pulse oximeter on Ava's tiny foot. The small screen flickered. For a moment, nothing. Then, 84%. Oxygen level. Another number appeared. 66 beats per minute. Gasps filled the room. Oh my God, Lauren sobbed, her hands covering her mouth. Dr. Carter blinked in disbelief, then turned to the family with a look of urgency. She has a heartbeat. She's showing signs of life. The weight of his words crashed over Ethan like a tidal wave. His knees nearly buckled. His daughter was alive. The stunned silence that followed was interrupted by the distant wail of approaching sirens. Ethan clenched Lauren's hand, his whole body shaking. This was supposed to be their daughter's funeral. Now, it had become a fight for her life. A race against time. The sound of sirens grew louder, slicing through the tension in the funeral home like a blade. Ethan and Lauren stood frozen, clinging to each other, their minds unable to process what was happening. Moments ago, they had been preparing to bury their daughter. Now, they were watching as paramedics rushed through the door, their expressions a mix of urgency and disbelief. A Dallas Fire Department EMT, a tall man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped forward. Where's the child? Dr. Carter turned to them, his voice steady but tense. Here, she has a pulse, oxygen levels at 84%, and movement in her hand. He looked back at the baby, still lying in the tiny white coffin, her face serene, as if she were simply sleeping. We need to move quickly. The paramedics wasted no time. One of them, a woman with blonde hair tied in a tight ponytail, gently lifted Ava from the coffin and placed her onto a stretcher. The sight of her tiny, fragile body surrounded by medical equipment sent a fresh wave of panic through Lauren. Please, be careful, she cried, reaching for Ava's hand, but one of the EMTs gently guided her back. Ma'am, we need space to assess her, he said, his tone firm yet understanding. Lauren bit her lip, her whole body trembling. Ethan wrapped his arm around her, grounding her in the moment. She's going to be okay, he whispered, more for himself than for her. One of the paramedics strapped an oxygen mask over Ava's small face while another placed electrodes on her chest, attaching them to a portable monitor. A beep sounded, then another, a rhythmic, steady pulse. She's definitely got a heartbeat, the EMT confirmed, adjusting the monitor. It's weak, but it's there. A collective gasp echoed through the room. A miracle. We have to get her to St. Joseph's now, the lead paramedic ordered, already pushing the stretcher toward the door. Ethan and Lauren instinctively followed, their feet moving before their minds could catch up. They reached the back of the ambulance just as the EMTs were loading Ava inside. "We're coming with you," Ethan insisted, but the paramedic shook his head. "I'm sorry, sir, but you can't ride with us. Follow in a car, we'll meet you there." "No, that's our daughter," Lauren sobbed. "We almost lost her once, we are not leaving her alone." Ethan's fists clenched. "You expect us to just sit in a car while our baby—" Before he could finish, the ambulance doors slammed shut, the siren blaring as it peeled out of the parking lot. For a moment, Ethan and Lauren stood there, stunned and motionless. How had everything flipped so fast? Just minutes ago, they were grieving. Now, they were fighting to keep their daughter alive. "Come on, I'll drive you." Daniel's voice broke through the haze. Their friend, who had fetched Dr. Carter earlier, was already by his car, waving them over. Without hesitation, Ethan grabbed Lauren's hand, and they jumped into the backseat. The second the doors shut, Daniel floored the gas, tires screeching against the pavement. The ride to St. Joseph Medical Center was a blur. The city streets rushed past them, but Ethan barely saw them. His mind was spinning. What if Ava didn't make it? What if this was false hope? Lauren stared out the window, her eyes distant. Her baby girl had moved, had breathed, had clung to life. But what if? She shook her head, unwilling to finish the thought. "Almost there," Daniel muttered, his grip tight on the steering wheel. The hospital loomed ahead, its red emergency lights glowing in the night. As soon as the car skidded to a stop, Ethan and Lauren bolted out, rushing toward the entrance. "Where's our daughter?" "Ava Parker. She was just brought in." Lauren's voice cracked as she gripped the nurse's desk. A doctor in a white coat turned toward them. His name badge read Dr. Mitchell. His face was unreadable. "I'm sorry, but you can't go in right now," he said, his tone disturbingly neutral. "What do you mean?" Ethan snapped. "That's our child in there." Dr. Mitchell sighed. "I understand, but this is a critical situation. You'll need to wait here." Lauren felt like she had been punched in the gut. "Please," she whispered, barely able to stand. "We need to be with her." But the doctor had already turned away. The double doors swung shut, cutting them off. Ethan clenched his fists, his chest rising and falling rapidly. This wasn't right. Something felt off. Minutes passed, then an hour. Every second stretched into eternity. No one told them anything. Lauren sat beside Ethan in the cold, sterile hallway, her hands gripping his like a lifeline. What if she? Lauren couldn't finish the sentence. Ethan closed his eyes, breathing heavily. He wouldn't let his mind go there. Not yet. Then, the doors swung open. Dr. Mitchell stepped out, his expression grim. His eyes met theirs, and in that moment, Ethan knew something was terribly wrong. The second heartbreak. The air in the hospital corridor felt heavy, suffocating. Ethan and Lauren shot to their feet the moment Dr. Mitchell emerged from the emergency room. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that made Ethan's stomach twist into knots. "Mr. and Mrs. Parker," the doctor began, his voice steady yet distant. Ethan tightened his grip on Lauren's hand. "Please, just tell us, is Ava okay?" His voice cracked at the end, betraying the fear clawing at his chest. Dr. Mitchell took a measured breath before speaking. "We ran multiple tests, including an electrocardiogram to confirm." He hesitated for a second too long. Then, his next words shattered them. "I'm sorry, there are no vital signs." The hospital walls seemed to close in. Lauren staggered backward as if she had been struck. "No," she gasped, shaking her head violently. "No, that's not possible. She was alive." She moved. She squeezed Ethan's hand. "The paramedics, they said she had a heartbeat." Ethan's vision blurred with rage and desperation. "What the hell are you saying? She was alive in that ambulance. We saw it with our own eyes." Dr. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably. glancing down at the clipboard in his hands. Sometimes, in rare cases, a patient recently pronounced deceased can exhibit post-mortem muscle contractions. It can create the illusion of movement, even reflexive responses. As for the pulse reading, oximeters can occasionally detect false signals, especially in cases of misread electrical impulses. Stop. Ethan's voice was low, shaking with barely contained fury. You're telling me that everything we saw, everything we felt, was just some medical glitch? Lauren let out a strangled sob, gripping her chest as if the weight of her grief might crush her. She was warm, she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. She wasn't cold like. Her knees buckled, and Ethan barely caught her before she collapsed. Dr. Mitchell sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. There are also cases where body temperature remains elevated for longer than expected post-mortem. It's rare but not unheard of. Lauren's entire body trembled against Ethan. Her mind refused to accept it. How could Ava be dead again? How could life be so cruel, to give them hope, only to rip it away? Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay upright even as the weight of the moment threatened to break him. He searched the doctor's face for something: remorse, hesitation, doubt, anything, but all he saw was clinical detachment. He didn't believe it. Something was wrong. Before Ethan could demand more answers, Dr. Mitchell spoke again, this time softer. You can see her now, if you'd like. Lauren let out a broken whimper. Ethan's jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. He felt his nails digging into his palms, his breath coming in short, furious bursts. But when he looked at Lauren, her face streaked with tears. He knew they had no choice. They had to face it. Dr. Mitchell led them down the hall, each step heavier than the last. The cold hospital lights flickered slightly, casting long shadows that made everything feel surreal, like a waking nightmare. Finally, they reached a small, sterile room. The doctor pushed the door open, revealing a tiny white sheet covering a stretcher. Lauren let out a choked cry the moment she saw her daughter. Ava lay still, her delicate arms stretched out, her tiny fingers relaxed as if waiting to be held. Ethan's knees almost gave out. He had held those hands. He had felt them move. Lauren moved first, slowly, like a woman walking through a dream she desperately wanted to wake from. She approached the stretcher. With trembling fingers, she touched Ava's hand, cold. A sob tore through her as she collapsed over the small body. No, my baby, my baby. Her cries were raw, filled with the kind of pain no parent should ever have to endure. Ethan stood motionless, his mind screaming that this couldn't be real, that this was a mistake, that this wasn't his daughter lying there, lifeless. And yet, there she was. His chest heaved as he stepped forward. His hands shook as he brushed his fingers over Ava's soft cheek, only now it wasn't warm. Lauren's words from earlier rang in his head. She was warm, she was breathing, so why wasn't she now? Ethan clenched his fists. This doesn't make sense, he murmured. His voice was hollow, filled with something dangerously close to rage. She was alive. Lauren sobbed harder. Dr. Mitchell, standing quietly near the door, finally spoke. I'll give you both some time. Then, without another word, he stepped out, leaving them in deafening silence. Ethan's head spun. He didn't trust them. None of this felt right. And as he stood over his daughter's small body, his grief was overshadowed by something else. The fight for truth and justice. Ethan stood over Ava's tiny body, his grief quickly transforming into something sharper: determination. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. Lauren, still sobbing softly, looked up at him. Ethan, what do we do now? He swallowed hard, his fists clenching at his sides. We fight. His voice was steady, filled with quiet resolve. Something's not right. Lauren, I don't believe them. I refuse to believe we almost buried our daughter alive, only for her to be dead again hours later. Lauren wiped her tear-streaked face, her breath shaky. Deep down, she knew he was right. But how? Who would listen to us? Ethan exhaled sharply. Someone will. That night, instead of collapsing into grief, Ethan and Lauren reached out to David Reynolds, a well-known attorney in Dallas who specialized in medical malpractice cases. Moved by their story, he agreed to help, pro bono. I can't ignore what's happened to your family, David told them during their first meeting. We need answers, and we're going to get them. The next few days were a whirlwind of investigations. interviews, and uncovering hidden truths. First, the firefighters who had transported Ava to the hospital confirmed that she had vital signs when they brought her in. They had no doubt about it. Then, security footage from St. Joseph Medical Center revealed that Dr. Mitchell had delayed ordering additional tests. And worse, there had been no urgency in his actions. Medical experts brought in by David examined the case and pointed out severe negligence. Not only had Ava been misdiagnosed the first time, but her second death was suspicious. The evidence was mounting, and when the media got hold of the story, the hospital found itself in the middle of a national scandal. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, supporters, and grieving parents who had faced similar tragedies filled every seat as the case against Dr. Mitchell and St. Joseph Medical Center unfolded. Lauren gripped Ethan's hand tightly as David presented the evidence, his voice unwavering. The medical system failed Ava Parker not once, but twice, he said, his words ringing through the silent courtroom. She was declared dead when she was still alive. Her parents nearly buried her. And when she was given a second chance, she was taken away again under suspicious circumstances. Dr. Mitchell sat across the room, his face pale. He had no defense against the facts laid out before him. When the jury delivered their verdict, the entire room held its breath. Dr. Mitchell is found guilty of medical negligence and malpractice. His medical license is permanently revoked, and he will face criminal charges. St. Joseph Medical Center is ordered to pay damages to the Parker family. Lauren broke down in tears, this time, not from grief, but from relief. They had won. Justice had been served. The story of Ava Parker became more than just a headline. It became a wake-up call for hospitals across the country. New policies were introduced to prevent misdiagnosis and improve procedures in handling cases of infant mortality. Hospitals nationwide were forced to reevaluate their protocols. And for Ethan and Lauren? They didn't let Ava's story end in tragedy. With the settlement money, they started the Ava Parker Foundation, dedicated to helping parents fight medical negligence and supporting families who had suffered loss due to hospital errors. They turned their pain into purpose. Years later, as they stood before a brand new children's clinic named in Ava's honor, Lauren squeezed Ethan's hand. "She's still with us," she whispered, smiling through her tears. Ethan nodded, looking up at the sky. Always. Ava's name would never be forgotten. Her story had changed lives. And her legacy would live on, forever.